Opening hook. I stood among shards of glass where my greenhouse used to glow. Water leaked from torn pipes and pooled around roots I had tended like a promise. Plants lay broken, their stems tangled in mud, and the silence pressed down harder than thunder. When did my own family decide my work was worth less than his temper? When did my sacrifice become a target? Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Please like, subscribe, and share, and stay close for what happened next with me. Background and family dynamics. I grew up in a small Ohio town where the grocery clerk knew your birthday, and the librarian set aside paperbacks she thought would suit your mood. The seasons told the truth there. You could hear it when lake winds rattled porch chimes in February and when cicadas stitched an evening together in July. My parents worked steady jobs and called it enough. They taught me to pay bills on time, bring casseroles to funerals, and never brag about what you have. They said pride belonged to loud people who did not finish what they started. I wanted a life that was quiet and finished. I was the older child, the daughter who learned early how to read forms and fill them out right the first time. My brother Mark, younger by 3 years, was the boy who slid through rules like water through a loose screen. If he missed curfew, the clock was wrong. If he failed algebra, the teacher hated boys. If he dented the car, the road had jumped. My parents believed him not because he was convincing, but because it hurt less than sizing the truth. At 15, I took a dishwashing job behind the counter at a diner that smelled like coffee and onions. I saved tips in a jar taped under my bed. At 16, I worked at the library shelving returns in rows that felt steadier than any family plan. I studied, earned scholarships, and left town for a community college that taught me how to keep books for a business that could not afford an accountant. I married young because love sounded like an address I might not find twice. We built a life with coupons and secondhand furniture. Then the marriage washed out during the years when the house felt smaller every month and the air inside it learned to hold its breath. Papers were signed, boxes were carried. Silence returned like a familiar guest. After the divorce, I went back to Ohio and rented a small place with a yard that sloped toward a strip of scrub trees. I worked mornings in a school cafeteria, afternoons at a hardware store, counting inventory while radios hummed sports talk above me. At night, I read about soil chemistry and lighting schedules and the spines of plants that manage wind better than people manage one another. The idea came like a lamp switched on in a room I had not noticed before. A greenhouse not as hobby but as a living. I started with a few trays in my kitchen window, then a plastic hoop house out back. I failed plenty. I learned how quickly fungus can punish a proud heart, how a watering can drown hope just as fast as neglect starves it. I learned patience the way children learn sidewalks, one step then the next. When I told my parents I wanted to build a real greenhouse, my mother patted my hand and said that sounded nice. My father asked what kind of tomatoes I planned to grow. Neither asked about budgets or grants or the way my chest lifted when I pictured glass catching morning light. Mark laughed and said, "You mean a fancy shed?" I said nothing. I applied for a small business grant and got it on my second try after revising the numbers until they stood straight. I added savings that had taken me 10 years to stack. I signed a modest loan that made my palms sweat. When the structure finally rose, steel ribs under a bare sky, I stood beside the crew and felt something like relief unspool inside me. It was not grand, but it was honest. It cost $22,000 by the time irrigation lines and temperature controls were tuned, which is another way of saying it cost years of saying no. My parents drove out to see it once parked on the gravel and said it looked bigger than they expected. My mother lifted a pot of basil to her face and smiled. My father asked if I was hiring. He meant for Mark. That was the first time I said no out loud. I said I needed reliability and records and safety around glass and chemicals. My mother said boys grow up in their own time. My father said family comes first. Mark said give me a chance and winked. I looked past him at trays of starts lined like little green vows and felt a cold current moving under the surface. No, I said. Not now. Maybe later when I am sure. The air cooled between us. He walked away with his hands in his pockets like a man who had misplaced a promise. The next week, my mother called to say I was being unkind. The week after that, my father stopped by with a socket set I had not asked to borrow and said the kind of help a brother needs is not written on a resume. I kept my voice level and said anyone who touches this place will treat it like a life. Mark asked again 2 months later, this time leaning against the door frame and watching me transplant a flat of rosemary. He said deliveries would be easy money and he could manage cash. I told him I did not do cash off the books because I did not plan to lose the roof over my head to a shortcut. He smiled in a way that felt like someone closing a cabinet too quietly. He said, "You think you are better than us now." I said, "I think I am careful." He shrugged and said, "You will regret it." I heard the line without hearing the threat until later. Families have ways of looking like they are just talking. Then the talk grows teeth. I kept working because work is the only thing I have ever found that quiets fear. Orders began to come in from restaurants and weekend gardeners. I made lists and schedules and watched numbers creep from red toward black. My days smelled like wet soil and peppermint, like something new learning to breathe. When I locked up at dusk, I walked down the gravel in tired shoes and felt okay for the first time in a very long time. The greenhouse and what it meant. The greenhouse was not just glass, it was a room where light behaved itself. Mornings began with a wash of pale gold that slid across benches and warmed the leaves until they loosened their grip on night. Fans hummed a steady note that made thought easier. The irrigation lines clicked on, and water threaded the air so fine it felt like breath. I kept orchids in baskets near the eastern wall because they liked shy light and regular talk. I kept herbs where people could brush them with their sleeves and carry scent away like a secret. I installed a simple but good control system so heat did not ruin a day that looked perfect to the eye. I learned where condensation collected and where it fell. I learned that basil forgives, time remembers, and rosemary holds its shape like a stubborn aunt who brings her own chair to a picnic. If you had walked in during that first season, you would have seen order everywhere. Rows straight enough to steady a heart. Labels written in a careful hand. Buckets lined along the wall like soldiers in a kinder army. I wrote every expense in a ledger I could touch, even though the computer did it better because some numbers feel truer when your fingers know them. $22,000 is a fact. It is also an ache. It was months of oatmeal, years of used coats, holidays spent making soup instead of plain reservations. That figure included the tempered glass that held up under hail and heat, the vents that opened like the throats of birds, the seed trays from a supplier who answered my questions like they were worth time. That figure also included mistakes. I bought the wrong timers once and learned how fast a sunny afternoon can turn cruel. I lost a crop of lettuce to slugs and wept because I knew better and forgot to act like it. The greenhouse became a sanctuary after the marriage ended, after the kind of loneliness that makes you forget your own laugh. I stood among living things and learned again what steady feels like. When storms rolled across the county, I listened to rain strike glass and watched the structure hold. I thought, so can I. Mark came by in that season like weather you cannot plan. He called the greenhouse a fancy shed and said it must be nice to play at business when other people had real jobs. I wiped my hands on a towel and kept transplanting because I have learned not to hand over my attention to someone who wants it for sport. He said, "Hire me for deliveries." I said no again this time, with a softness that made him angrier than if I had shouted. He called me rigid. I called myself careful. Careful is not a word people applaud until after the building is still standing. As orders picked up, pride wrapped its arms around my ribs in a way that made breathing both larger and calmer. The first profitable month came like a sunrise. I exhaled, called the bank, and paid a little extra on the loan. That night I ate dinner on an upturned crate with the door open and the fans turning while bats drew tight black seams in the sky. I do not remember what I ate. I remember thinking that the life I wanted was not a miracle. It was a plan I kept. The plan looked small to other people. To me, it looked like a room I could enter without bracing. I was reading at the kitchen table when the phone rang. It was Mr. Jenkins from down the road, a man who wears the same cap to church and the hardware store. He said, "You better come quick." I was in my car before the second ring would have finished if I had let it. The road between my house and the greenhouse is a string of familiar turns. A greenhouse should throw a soft glow even in bad weather. Mine did not. Shadows moved where they did not belong. When I stepped out, I heard water. It sounded like a faucet left running in another room you cannot find. I smelled fertilizer and sap and something metallic that had no place there. The glass was broken, not cracked from heat or a fallen branch. Smashed. Panes punched through edges jagged like a mouth that had been in a fight. Steel frames bent where a person had swung a crowbar and swung again. The irrigation lines were cut, not ripped by accident. Pots were overturned and their contents ground under a heel. Stems hung like broken wrists. The fans were silent. In that quiet, the drip and pool of water grew loud enough to make thinking feel like lifting something heavy. I walked in without remembering to watch for glass and heard it crunch. It felt wrong to lift my feet as if bowing would be more respectful. I knelt and put my hands in mud. I wish I could tell you that anger came first. It did not. Grief arrived like a tide that changes the shape of the shore while you are standing on it. I picked up a crushed rosemary and held it and smelled regret and effort and the small mercy of scent that survives rough hands. Mr. Jenkins stepped in behind me and said he had seen Mark earlier hanging around the edge of the property with something long in his hand that flashed when lightning far away did its best to arrive. A crowbar, he thought. He said he figured it was not his business until my lights were not on and his wife said you go make sure. He looked away like a man who had failed an exam no one told him he could study for. The police came with steady faces. They took pictures and statements and the calves of their pants got wet where the water kept running. They followed a track of boot prints to where a truck had stained the gravel with the kind of oil that tells you the driver ignores noises. They found Mark 2 hours later at a friend's place where games are played that never end with winners, only with exhaustion. He was drunk enough to be loud and sober enough to aim his voice. When they put him in the car, he looked at me and said, "You should have given me a job." That was not a confession. It was a manifesto. My parents arrived before the last flashlight left the ground. My mother cried the way a person cries when they are desperate for a script to fit and none fits. My father talked about insurance and misunderstandings and the way boys do not measure strength. He said, "This is family business." He said, "We will fix it." He did not look at the plants. He did not step where glass might bite him. He looked at the officers the way a man looks at distant weather and tells himself the storm will break up by morning. I stood up finally, and my knees left a shape in the mud. I wiped my hands on my jeans and felt grit and loss. I said I would be pressing charges. My mother's head snapped up. She said, "You cannot do that to your own brother." I said he did this to me first. She said he did not think. I said he thought enough to bring a crowbar. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry then. There are tears that wash a face clean and tears that make it hard to see. Under daylight, the damage had edges that night had blurred. The phone rang at 9. My parents. They wanted to come by. I said the door was open. They arrived with an envelope thick enough to pinch. My father held it like a solution. He said, "Take this and we can all calm down. Drop the charges and we will make you whole." My mother said, "Your brother is not himself when he is angry. You have always been the strong one. Forgive him. Family does not treat family like criminals." The words sounded like lines auditioned for a play that used to draw a crowd. I looked at the envelope. Money can be a tool. Money can be a hush. This was the second kind. I asked if they had been to the greenhouse. My father said, "We saw enough last night." My mother said, "A mess is still a mess whether you look at it for an hour or all day." I said it was not a mess, it was deliberate. She put a hand to her chest as if I had pushed her. She said, "Your words are sharp." I said the glass was sharper. I pushed the envelope back toward my father. He did not take it at first. He thought I would change my mind if the paper perched there long enough. I told him to pick it up. He did. My mother started to cry, that particular thin cry that begs for someone to stop the tape and rewind. She said, "You used to be kind." I said, "I am still kind, but I am no longer willing to be quiet to keep a lie standing." My father said, "We can pay for repairs and make the police go away." I said, "The police will go away when the court tells them to and not before." He called me cruel. I looked at his hands and thought of all the times those hands lifted Mark from trouble like a fisherman lifting a net. I did not say that out loud because some truths cut more than they heal. That evening, my mother called again and tried another door. She said, "Think of your brother's future. This will ruin him." I said, "He ruined my present." She said, "Be the bigger person." I said being bigger is not the same as being a rug. She hung up without saying goodbye, and in that click, I heard the old hierarchy closing like a trunk. 2 days later, Mark called from a number I did not recognize. He said, "You made your point." I said I was not making a point. I was naming a crime. He laughed in a way I recognized from childhood, the laugh he used when he broke a lamp and dared me to tell. He said, "A part of you likes this being the important one for once." I ended the call, wrote the time in my notebook, and went back to the greenhouse with a broom and a box of heavy-duty bags. Pressure piled up the way snowbanks along a fence until posts disappear. My parents called every morning and every evening. When I did not answer, they left messages that braided guilt with advice. They sent Aunt Louise to my door with a lemon pie and a speech about how we all make mistakes and the town remembers who forgives. They had a neighbor lean on my porch rail and tell me he had known my father since boyhood, and I would not want to be the reason a man lost sleep at his age. Even the pastor dropped by to say that justice and mercy are twins who fight but share the same face. I made coffee for the pastor and thanked him and told him mercy is not the same as a free pass. He nodded slowly and said sometimes a door is not a door at all until it closes. At the courthouse, Mark did not look chastened. He looked like a man certain that gravity was about to change its mind. In the hallway, he leaned toward me and said, "You could end this." His smile was not kind. It was a dare drawn thin. I said I would be telling the truth on the stand. He said, "I taught you a lesson." He said, "You shut me out and I showed you you are not untouchable." The words slid into the space between us and sat there like something that had been waiting a long time to be named. I felt heat rise then drop. Under the heat came a cold that was not shock. It was recognition. He had not stumbled into harm. He had chosen it to correct me. He thought he was a teacher and I was a student who needed breaking. I walked into the courtroom and took a seat. My parents sat behind me. I could feel their breath like a draft. The judge set dates. Papers were shuffled. Nothing cinematic happened, which is its own relief and its own despair. On the way out, my father caught my sleeve and said, "Enough is enough." His voice shook. I said enough arrived last week when the glass fell. He let go of my sleeve like a man letting go of a rope he hoped would pull a boat back. That night, I returned to what used to be Rose and found a small pot tucked under a bench that had not been kicked. Inside, a seedling had pushed 2 leaves into light. It looked both silly and holy standing there in the wreckage. I cupped the pot and lifted it carefully, wiping mud with the corner of my shirt. At home, I set it on the kitchen table and watched it while the kettle hummed. The sprout became a kind of promise I could point at. The next morning, my parents came with another envelope, thinner this time, which felt worse. My mother said, "Please." She said, "Your brother will not survive jail." I said, "He will survive consequences." She said, "You want to punish us for loving him." I said, "I want you to love him with a kind of love that requires him to stop hurting people." She wept and asked when I had become so hard. I said I became clear. My father said, "One day you will need us." I almost said I needed you last week, and you chose the person who did the breaking over the person who was broken. I did not. There is a kind of silence that is not surrender. It is a boundary. Consequences and inner growth. Consequences came in plain envelopes and sideways looks. Court notices, repair estimates, insurance letters that spoke a language meant to make you tired. At the grocery store, a woman I had known since we were both 10 looked at me, then away, then back. In the hardware aisle, a man cleared his throat before asking if I was really pressing charges against my own kin. I told him the truth. I said I was telling a judge what happened. He nodded as if I had said nothing. People like a story where righteousness smiles. They do not know what to do with a story where righteousness keeps records and makes appointments. My parents stopped calling for a while. Then they called again to say holidays would be complicated, and perhaps I should visit earlier or later than the day itself, so no one would feel uncomfortable. I told them I would not be carving my life around someone else's temper anymore. Word went around that I was unyielding. Fine. The first days of cleanup were slow. I worked in gloves and old boots and still found glass making itself known in my palms and the cuffs of my socks. Neighbors began to arrive the way dawn gathers. One brought a shop vacuum. Another brought a generator and said, Run your tools without worrying about outlets. A retired carpenter named Carlos stopped by and asked if he could look at the frames. He knocked the metal with 2 knuckles and listened like a doctor. He said he would help straighten and reinforce if I could stand him talking to himself while he worked. I told him talk is the sound of help. A woman named Ruth from the next road came with a shoebox of saved seeds and a story about her husband fixing tractors. She said things that grow do not care who owned yesterday. She pressed the box into my hands like a blessing. A girl from the high school came after classes with her hair still wet from swim practice. She said her coach told the team to show up if they wanted community service hours. She stayed 2 hours after the others left and asked me why Rosemary is so stubborn. I told her stubborn keeps soup honest. We both laughed a little, and it did not feel disloyal to grief. Every evening I made a list of what had been cleared and what still waited. I swept glass from corners where it hid and wondered how much of my life had been spent cleaning up what other people refused to see. The answer did not matter as much as the motion of the broom in my hands. I replaced irrigation lines section by section with the kind of satisfaction that never photographs well, but holds a person together. Money was tight. Donations from customers and a small emergency grant from a local business group kept me from drowning. I learned to rebuild with less. I learned to say yes when help was offered and no when help wanted headlines. The case moved forward. Mark pled to a lesser charge after his lawyer explained that juries do not love men who brag. They meant to teach a woman a lesson. He owed restitution. He received probation. He glared at me in the hallway with a face I did not recognize. It looked like a boy who had finally met gravity. My parents said little. When they did speak, they used words like disappointing and unnecessary. And why could you not have handled this with us? I reminded them I had tried to handle life with them since I was a child, and they had handled Mark instead. They did not answer. Silence is a teacher too. The first tray of seedlings I planted after the repairs set, roots like a decision that holds. I walked the aisle at dawn and touched leaves with the back of my fingers and thanked them for trying. I thanked myself for trying. It felt awkward. Then it felt true. I noticed the small cuts on my hands healing thin white lines where pain had been. I learned a new kind of patience that did not wait for other people to behave. It waited for me to become steady no matter what they chose. The sprout I had rescued from the wreck grew into a small, strong plant, with a stem that leaned toward the window as if it knew where the world was kinder. I set it near the entrance on a shelf where customers would see it when I reopened. I wanted them to know a thing that simple and small can survive even when a person with a tool tries to make an absence. Business returned in modest waves. Some apologized for not coming sooner. Some pressed cash into my hand and refused change. Some bought nothing and left a note that said, "Do not quit." I did not. I will not. This morning, sunlight slid through new panes and laid itself across benches like a promise kept. The framework is stronger where Carlos adjusted the angles and said, "There now, it will carry what comes." The irrigation line ticks on with the modest confidence of a machine that has learned to be faithful. The air smells like mint and damp earth and work. I think about the night of the breaking and the week after when my parents arrived with envelopes and names for me I refused to keep. Those memories still hold a temperature, but they no longer burn. They sit on a shelf with other truths I do not argue with anymore. I see now that I was trained to be the larger vessel, the one that holds everyone else's spill. I was told to be the bigger person without being given the dignity of being a person at all. Forgiveness was treated like a mop, not a mystery. Now I know that peace sometimes sounds like a firm voice naming what happened. It sometimes looks like walking into a room full of people who would prefer you look away and keeping your eyes open. It sometimes feels like standing alone at a sink, washing soil from your hands and deciding not to go back to small. If you think I am proud, I will not argue. Pride is not a loud dress. It is the steadiness of a woman who keeps showing up for her own life. The greenhouse is open again. The rescued plant sits near the door, larger now, its leaves catching bits of sun that pass through like a blessing. I touch it when I lock up at night. It reminds me that a thing can be knocked down, cut back, starved of light, and still turn toward the sky the minute you lift the weight. My parents still wrestle with the story in their way. Holidays are shorter and quieter. I bring rolls and leave early. I no longer sit through lectures about loyalty delivered by people who confuse love with erasure. I love them. I also love the person I am when I do not abandon myself to keep them comfortable. There is a room of light at the edge of town where rows hold steady and little green facts grow from dark soil. Every morning I step inside and remember that dignity is not something other people hand you. It is something you wear even when the floor is broken. It is the way you hold your shoulders when someone calls you cruel for choosing safety. It is the breath you take before saying no again. If you have ever been told to forgive someone who never apologized, how did you answer? If you have been pressured to keep a secret that was never yours to keep, what did it cost you and what did you do to buy your life back? If this story met you where you are, please like, subscribe, and share it with a friend who might need a quiet, strong voice today. Thank you for spending this time with me. I wish you steady work, good light, and protection for everything you have grown with love.